and by the time he got to the top of the hill, the broken bucket would have leaked out most of the water that he placed into it at the bottom, but he used what he had from the broken bucket and the full bucket to water the crops at the top of the hill. Well, people eventually took note of this, and they started asking, man, why don't you just replace that old bucket? You can get you a better bucket and have more water once you get to the top of the hill. And the old farmer pointed back down the hill at a row of flowers that were along the path beneath the spot where the broken bucket would leak. The point he sought to make in pointing this out, church, is that sometimes God uses broken things to yield beauty. I think this is maybe the idea that Paul had in mind when he, in 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9, said about himself, he delighted in what God said about him when he said that his grace is sufficient for him. Paul, the servant, hears from the Lord, and he says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power, my strength is perfected in weakness. It's made complete in weakness. So I don't know what situation you may be up against right now, church, or maybe even soon to be up against, where you're going to need to remember God's strength in the face of your own weakness. But what I do know, church, is that God so often takes weak, broken things in people in order to work wonders and beauty through them. So often does the Lord take weak, broken vessels to do marvelous things with them. And so if you're in a place today where you feel confronted with your own weakness or insufficiency, either for a specific task or just in the day-to-day task that God has put before you, friends, know that you are in good company. Moses had to learn this lesson about the cohabitation of God's strength and his own weakness in order to be a faithful servant to the task that God was calling him to. And we've seen thus far in the book of Exodus where Moses descends from the lineage of people who are enslaved and oppressed in Egypt, and he's now fled from the land of Egypt, and he had to flee because he came to the defense of one of his kinsmen who was being beaten by an Egyptian. When Moses killed the Egyptian, people found out about it. Moses had to flee, and it's now been 40 years since all of that has taken place. And Moses has now kind of made a life for himself in the land of Midian. Several decades. He's probably tried to put this thing behind him on purpose. And so as he's in the land of Midian, just going about his everyday business, God meets him there in the form of a burning bush and begins a conversation with him we saw in chapter 3. And in this conversation, God has already revealed to Moses his power and his character. Just by the nature and the way in which he appears, he's revealed to Moses and demonstrated his character and power through the encounter that he's having with Moses. And in this encounter, God calls Moses to be a rescuer of his people who have been enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. And where we left off a few weeks ago, we're at the end of chapter 3, God tells Moses that when he's faithful to this, he and his people would plunder the Egyptians. So God's saying to Moses, that verse, you see the last words right before we get to chapter 4, the verses we're looking at today. God says to Moses, you will plunder the Egyptians when you go back as a rescuer to pull my people out of enslavement. I'm going to so empower y'all that you're going to plunder them. You're going to leave, not just by the skin of your teeth, but you're going to leave with abundance. God's told Moses this, and as the conversation goes on, we see that the reluctance Moses felt in the early parts of the conversation, it continues. Moses continues to be reluctant to answer, to trust, to obey as God is calling him to this unique task. I mean, even as he's standing there on holy ground, church, witnessing this miraculous power of God on display through the bush that's on fire but is not burning up. Even after he's heard God declare of his own unending power, friends, Moses is still reluctant to believe and trust, and therefore his struggle to trust results in a struggle to obey. And as Moses struggled to trust, friends, we learn a few lessons about why God is worthy of being trusted and obeyed whenever he calls us. The first lesson we learn is that God is worthy of our trust and obedience because of his power. Now, God shows Moses this in a radical kind of way. When Moses brings his first excuse about why he can't go and do what God has called him to do, he says it's because the people may not believe him and follow him. He says, verse 1, what if they don't believe me and will not obey me, but say, the Lord did not appear to you? So Moses is first worried about the people. And this is somewhat merited, right? I mean, the last time Moses saw this group of people 40 years ago was when he'd come to their defense, but then tried to act as a mediator to them. And instead of meeting him with respect and a kind of response of gratitude for defending them, they met him with accusation and contempt. So Moses is like, Lord, these people probably aren't going to follow me. But God's about to show Moses, friends, that he has the power to make his people follow the leader who he raises up. And God's going to demonstrate this to Moses through a series of miraculous signs. It's almost like a little dress rehearsal in which he allows Moses to see a preview of the power by which he plans to lead these people out of enslavement into freedom. The first sign, God uses Moses' staff to demonstrate his power. Notice he takes what Moses already has. That's a whole sermon in itself right there. He takes his ordinary, everyday thing that Moses has. A staff for a shepherd would have been something they took everywhere. It's like a wallet for the rest of us. So he takes what Moses already has and he demonstrates his power to take this ordinary thing and do extraordinary things with it. He says to Moses, "What's in your hand, bro?" Moses is like, "Well, this is my staff." And so then God tells Moses, he's like, "Take your staff and throw it on the ground." Or Moses threw his staff on the ground, friends, and the staff, before his very eyes, turns into a snake or a serpent, some translations may say. And so Moses runs away. Could have been because he was afraid of the serpent. Could have been because he was afraid of what had just taken place. If it were me, it probably would have been a little bit of both. It's not every day that you see sticks turn into snakes. And whenever I do see a snake, I interpret the snake as a problem. And so Moses, like many of the rest of us would have done, he runs away. That as a way of demonstrating his power and showing Moses what he could do through him, God was like, no. We're not going to run from this serpent. God's saying to Moses that the day of his people running from and having to flee from serpents and evil is coming to an end. And so God said, no, we're not going to run from this one. Pick this one up by the tail. And so Moses reaches out and he picks the snake up. And in his hands, friends, the staff that had become a snake again becomes a staff. And God says to Moses, I'm going to do stuff like this so that they know the God of all power actually did appear to you. But now, just in case this wasn't enough for Moses, God gives a second sign right on the heels of this first one. The next thing he does is he tells Moses to put his hand inside his cloak. His cloak would have been the robe or the kind of overcoat that he was wearing. And God says, put your hand in there, put your hand inside your cloak, and then pull it back out. Well, Moses places his hand inside the cloak, and when he pulls it back out, it was diseased. This would have been some sort of leprosy. Some translations even tell us plainly that it was leprosy that Moses was experiencing here. His hand was struck with leprosy in an instant. But then God says, put it back in again and pull it out a second time. And when Moses does this the second time, his hand was restored. God healed it. He made it new as if nothing had ever happened. And then again, God says, friends, with signs like these, I'll show the people why they need to believe you've encountered me. God says, as a matter of fact, just in case there's even more needed, I'll give a third sign. When you get to the land of Egypt, take some water from the Nile River, pour it on the dry ground in front of you, and I'm going to turn that water from the river into blood right before your eyes and before the people's eyes so that they know without a shadow of a doubt that you come in my power when you come to rescue them. So here we have these three signs, church. God gives these three miraculous signs to convince Moses to go to the people with confidence and then to foreshadow how he convinced the people to go with Moses when he came to rescue them. God's saying through these signs, church, I'm more powerful than any other being. And therefore, I have the power to rescue my people through this human rescuer who I am sending to them. And the signs in themselves are astonishing, beloved. Like these signs at face value should have been enough for Moses to feel a sense of confidence in the Lord and his power and go to rescue God's people like he was calling them to. Like that should have been enough, just the signs themselves. On the surface, face value should have been enough. But then when you take into account that attached to each of these miracles that show God's power is a specific message that tells of God's authority, then these miracles, friends, they get to be even more astounding and even more of a testament about how God could indeed rescue his people through Moses. You see, when God turned Moses' staff into a snake or a serpent, it wasn't just an arbitrary animal that God chose. God chose this animal that was the idolized symbol of strength for the Egyptian people and the ancient symbol of evil for the people of God. Remember, I told you a few weeks ago that in Egyptian culture, the snake or the serpent, oftentimes depicted as a cobra, it was a symbol of strength and power and divinity for the Egyptians. That's why we so often see snakes as designs that are associated with ancient Egypt, right? The serpent here, it was so revered in Egyptian culture that the kings in Egypt they'd have cobras engraved on their jewelry and clothing as a symbol of identifying with this animal. Egypt's kings viewed themselves as a kind of serpentine ruler of the day. And so when God takes the staff and he turns it into a serpent, friends, and then back into a staff when Moses picks it up, it's God saying through this miracle, the power of Egypt and their rulers, they have nothing on the power of me through my servant. He's saying the very thing that they look to as a symbol of unbreakable strength, I take and I wield control over it in an effortless kind of way. He's saying, I'm the one who's able to take what people think is strong and show it to actually be weak, while I take the things that are weak and demonstrate my power and strength through them. And the same message, friends, is carried on into the second sign, when Moses stuck his hand back and forth into that cloak, and it went from being clean and strong to being weak with leprosy, demonstrating, and then back to being strong again. It was God demonstrating his power to instantaneously afflict the strong and instantaneously strengthen or restore the weak. Leprosy was considered a kind of death sentence in ancient Near Eastern culture. This wasn't a diagnosis that you play around with. It was a disease that literally ate away at your body from the inside out. I told you this before. In the worst cases of leprosy, people would actually have limbs to fall off because their flesh was dying from the inside with rot and disease. And there was no instant cure for it either. People with leprosy often had to embrace a lifestyle of complete isolation for years. There were all kinds of treatments and extensive processes that they'd have to go through in order to hopefully be healed and restored to life and community at some point in time. And so when God tells Moses to stick his hand in and out of that cloak, and from one moment to the next, it goes from being well to leprous, back to being well again, it's God saying through this sign, church, I've got power to instantaneously weaken the strong and strengthen the weak. In an instant, I can afflict what's whole and restore what is broken. And so he's saying, and so Egypt, they may appear to be strong because they've got my people enslaved in their land. And my people may appear to be weak because they're under the oppressive rule of Egypt. But in just one moment, in an instant, I'm about to flip this thing upside down. God's saying, by my power, Egypt will be weakened. And by my power, my people will be strengthened. And by my power, you, Moses, my servant, can go in confidence, because with my power, friends, justice will be served for the oppression that my people have experienced for all these years. The serving of justice, that's what the third sign is giving indication of. God says he's going to turn the water from the Nile into blood on the ground. Well, the Nile River was a great source of provision for the nation of Egypt. It was likely the thing that had allowed them to become so dominant in this day. If you think back to what we know from Genesis, right, there was these people in a desert. There was a famine that had taken place. And during this great famine, when nobody else had food, water, or livestock, Egypt had it all because the Nile allowed them to maintain it all. So it quite literally was a resource that the Egyptians looked to as a source of life and prominence for their nation. But if you recall back to what happened in chapter 1, then you know that the Nile River was also a place of death. And metaphorically speaking, it was actually a river of blood. The evil king of Egypt gave an order for all the Hebrew baby boys to be thrown into this river so that the Hebrews couldn't continue to multiply and spread out across his land and run the risk of overthrowing his kingdom. And so countless babies had been dumped into this river to their death. And so when God says he's going to turn water from the Nile into blood, it's him sending the message, friends. I haven't forgotten what was done to my people. The river was a place of death for the people of God. It had been a sign of life for the Egyptians. And God says, I'm turning that upside down now. The water that has sustained the Egyptians and has kept them and sustained their life for all these years, it's about to become a symbol of death through this miracle. And the lives that were unjustly taken when these babies were thrown in, those lives will not be forgotten. This sign, church, it beckons the idea of the babies being drawn out in remembrance and the Egyptians being doomed to death as their source of life is now cut off. And so through Moses, these miracles that God sends them with, God is saying, friends, I weaken the strong, I strengthen the weak, and my power is made clear by the signs I do through this rescuer that I'm sending to my people. And does this not sound familiar or similar to the reality that we're all living in today, church? Because you see, after Moses, there was another rescuer who came and performed miracles that made the power of God clear. Moses grabbed a serpent and it became a staff. Jesus has crushed the serpent who introduced us all to sin. Moses had his hand be restored and made well in an instant. Friend, Jesus restores and heals and makes new all who trust in him at the instant they begin trusting in him. Moses turned water into blood to remember the dead. Jesus shed his own blood to resurrect the dead to new life. And here's the thing, church. The pinnacle of Jesus' signs, they're still showing God's power today. The tomb that they placed him in is still missing a corpse. The death that they murdered him to, it is still missing a victim. The life that Christ rose to, friends, it is still being lived, and the throne he ascended to is still being occupied. The power of God is still being shown through the signs of Jesus, even today. And so here's the question, church. When it comes time for you to trust and obey God, will you? Will you allow the things that you know to be true about God, the power that God has so clearly demonstrated through Jesus and in a number of other ways in your life, will you allow that power to compel you to trust him in evangelism, to trust him as you serve the church in a new way, to trust him in your parenting, to trust him in your finances? Will his power compel you, church, to trust and obey him in whatever he's calling you to, or will you be more like Moses? You see, Moses elected not to trust and obey God immediately. And it's through his reluctance that we're going to learn now that God should be trusted because not just of his power, but also because of his promise. We should trust and obey God because he's got power, but also because he's faithful to his promises. So even after seeing all that God has done and hearing all that God has said in this conversation, Moses was still like, okay, Lord, so you might be able to overcome the people's unbelief, but you probably won't be able to work with my insufficiency. Moses, I know that you may overcome their belief, but what about me? He's like, Lord, I don't talk good. And I know I just saw these miracles you performed with the staff and my hand and what you say about the river and all of that stuff. I get that, Lord, but I don't know if you can do anything with this tongue of mine. You know, it's a lot harder to trust God, church, when we think the power of God being effective depends on us being qualified as instruments. And here's what's interesting about this. I've always read this passage and just assumed that Moses was being honest and true and that he likely had some kind of speech impediment. But there are scholars who argue that this may not have actually been the case. Think about it. Moses is the same man who wrote all of the first 5 books of the Bible and at least one of the Psalms. And when you go read what Moses writes, it's pretty clear this is a man who was good with words. But even on top of that, friends, the biography we read about Moses in Acts chapter 7, it says in Acts 7:22 that Moses was, quote, powerful in his speech. I mean, even the way he talks about his own eloquence in today's passage, it's done with eloquent and poetic speech. My tongue is sluggish, Lord. Who with a sluggish tongue talks like that? He couldn't have said it no more pretty than that. But for whatever reason, friends, Moses doesn't feel qualified to do what the Lord is calling him to do. It could be because he hasn't been in Egypt for 40 years. Maybe he feels rusty and he's Egyptian. Maybe he's being self-deprecating and kind of putting himself down in a way of false humility. Or it could be that he's just making excuses to try to get out of what God is calling him to do. Whatever combination of these things it is, friends, Mo is essentially saying, look, God, I don't think my eloquence is to the standard that I would deem necessary for me to go and do what you're calling me to do. Apparently, Moses is so focused on Moses that he's missing all that God has shown himself to be. It's hard to trust and follow God, church, when we're looking at ourselves instead of looking up at him. I mean, God has just shown Moses all these signs, all these miracles he's just performed right before his eyes. He used his own staff to perform these miracles. What more could Moses need? And on top of that, let's not forget that this is the same conversation in which God has revealed in this passage his personal name to Moses. Remember the sermon from a few weeks ago? God told Moses that his name is Yahweh or Jehovah. It's the name that means that God is everything he needs to be whenever he needs to be it. It's the name that means that God is everything his people need him to be whenever we need him to be it. It's the name, church, that when written in our Bibles, it appears as the word Lord written in all caps. Capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. But if you take note of the way Moses refers to God when he talks to him in verses 10 and 13, you'll see that the word Lord is not written in all caps. You see, Moses is using a general title to refer to God instead of using his personal name to refer to him. And there's nothing inherently wrong about that, but you would think that in his conversation where God has just told Moses, my name literally means that everything ever to be needed can be found in me. Like you think that in this conversation, Moses would remember that and refer to him by this name and trust in the truth of it as God is calling him to do something that he feels unqualified to do. Church, I wonder how often our irrational fears stem back to us failing to consider all that God is. We're afraid of what God calls us to because we're not considering God's character in the midst of the call. And so in light of Moses' reluctance, friends, God makes him a promise. Verses 11 through 12. Who placed a mouth on humans, God says? Who makes a person mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak, and I will teach you what to say. Friends, God promised to be Moses' aid, his help. He promised that whenever he felt alone in the work, he wouldn't actually be as alone as he felt. He promised that whatever insufficiency there was, he could overcome it because he made Moses and his mouth, and he had the power to use Moses for his purposes. In this statement, friends, God promises help and guidance, and that should have been all Moses needed. I mean, the God who just performed these signs, the God who is Yahweh Jehovah, the God who is speaking through a bush that's on fire but is not burning up, that God says, I'll go with you and I'll help you to do what I'm calling you to do. But Moses, like us a lot of the time, he was too easily forgetful of what God had done and who God had shown himself to be. Hear me, church. Don't let spiritual amnesia hinder your trust of God. Don't let forgetfulness tempt you to disobey God. In those moments when you feel it's hard to trust and obey the Lord's direction, take yourself back to what you've already seen him do. Take yourself back to who you already know him to be. Remind yourself that God has a perfect track record, and therefore his promise to be with us and help us follow him should embolden us to trust and obey him in whatever he calls us to. We can trust and obey God, friends, because of his power, his promises, and lastly, we can also trust and obey him because of his provision. He's got power. He's faithful to his promises, but he also provides. The conversation continues, and so does Moses' reluctance. The dude's not getting it. Verse 13, it becomes clear why Moses is struggling so bad. He's run out of excuses, and so now he just plainly says, Lord, can you please just send somebody else? Translation, I really just don't want to do this. I don't want to be the one to go and be used in this way. And the next verse tells us that God's anger burned against Moses. Now that's an interesting statement, church. It's making clear for us that God does not approve of this ongoing reluctance from Moses. The statement's literal translation is that God's nose grew hot. You know how we blush, or chocolate people don't really blush. Vanilla people, y'all know how you blush and you can sometimes see what you feel in your face? It's a phrase that's being used to kind of demonstrate this passion that God is feeling toward Moses' reluctance. It's a rhetorical way to indicate God's manifest anger against his sinful reluctance from Moses. Not that God is reacting in a fit or pouting in response to what Moses does, but that God's righteous anger, his righteous desire and will, which is always perfectly present and engaged, it does indeed sometimes show up or manifest in the form of anger when we come against his desire and will. And we need to take this into account, church, because this reminds us that obedience to God's will is not optional. We need to do what God says. But we also get to take into account that even when we're disobedient, friends, God is merciful with provision. The rest of the passage gives us a snapshot of how mercifully God provides for his servants. And so when Moses kind of waffles in fear and reluctance, disobedience, God provides a companion for the task. God accompanies Moses through Aaron in spite of his disobedience. And he does this in a profound way, right? He says Aaron, who was Moses' brother, who did speak well, will accompany Moses. And so God sets up this kind of mediating relationship with them where God would hear from Moses, or Moses would hear from God. Moses would tell Aaron what to say to the people, then Aaron would say it to the people, and the people would be able to hear from God in this kind of miraculous prophetic way of Moses and Aaron in their partnership that God had formed between the two of them. He says Aaron would be like Moses' mouth, Mo would be like God speaking to and through Aaron. And the radical thing about God's provision here is not just that God gave it in spite of Moses' disobedience. It's that God demonstrates how he actually proactively provides for his people. God was steps ahead of Moses in this whole thing. Notice as it says in verse 14 that Aaron would already be on the way to meet Moses. God says in the midst of this conversation, Aaron is now on the way to meet you. And in the next passage we see in verse 27, we're going to see next week, I believe, we see where it says that God told Aaron to go meet Moses. The beautiful thing about all of this, church, is that God knew the struggle Moses would have, and God provided all that was needed beforehand. It's a beautiful reality that God goes before us to provide all we need for faithfulness, church. And this whole conversation with the back and forth between Moses and God, Moses may have thought he was in some kind of negotiation with God, but this was really Moses negotiating with himself. God hasn't learned or been informed of anything new in this conversation. But God has taught Moses, and he's also taught us that he's worthy of our trust and obedience when he calls us. Why? Because he has power to fulfill whatever he calls us to. He has promised to be with us as we're on mission for him, and he gives the provision needed for the mission he calls us to. Reading and studying this passage made me think of the lyrics from the song I referenced earlier, the song that is influencing the title for this sermon, Trust and Obey. The lyrics go in this way: when we walk with the Lord in the light of his word, what a glory he sheds on our way. While we do his good will, he abides with us still, and with all who trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way. Friends, Moses in this passage is a really poor example of what trust and obedience looks like. I mean, we see here that he gives two excuses, and with neither of them does he look to God. The first excuse, he's looking outside himself at the people. He's concerned with these external things that he can't control. The second excuse he gives, he looks internally. It's like, Lord, I'm not able to do what you're calling me to do. Not once does he look at God himself. And so he's a poor example of what trust and obedience looks like, church. But thankfully, he's not the final example that the Bible gives us. You see, Jesus, like Moses, wrestled with the weight of the call that he had to be a rescuer. But Jesus, unlike Moses, prayed the prayer that we see in Luke chapter 22. Father, if you're willing, take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. That's what trust and obedience looks like. So the next time you're in a position, church, where you feel weak or insufficient for a task that God has given you, don't give the excuses that Moses gave. Pray the prayer that Jesus prayed. His strength, his power, it is made complete and perfect in our weakness. And we can rest with trust and obedience in light of that truth. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, we thank you for your word, for all that it shows us about you being a trustworthy God, for all that it shows us about the joys of us being obedient people to your commands, to your calls. God, I pray and ask that we would fix in our minds the reality that obedience to you is not optional, and it's not something we have to go about with reluctance. It's only and always best for us, God. So give us grace by your Spirit to be faithful, to trust you, to obey you, and to rejoice at the use of ourselves and the use of your people that we get to witness in the process. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Church, we're going to get ready to partake in the Lord's Supper. So ushers can go ahead and head to the back.